Hello everyone, my name is Eric. I am a freshly minted private pilot. I just passed my check ride about a month and a half ago. And I really wanted to get on here and share my experience with you, what I went through the check ride, and how I really prepared for it. I started training in July of last summer. I had 42 hours of flight training before I was check ride ready. 8 of those hours were actually on a single cross country. So more or less, I was probably about 35 hours before I was check ride ready. One of the ways that really helped me do that was I flew 2 to 3 times a week, and I was really adamant on getting in the airplane anytime there was good weather and we were able to fly. It really helped me on building from the previous lesson rather than spending so much time recapping what I had done before. We were really able to just jump right into the next lesson and build on what we had done previously. So if you're really looking to try and expedite your training and get the most out of your training, flying as often as possible is really a key to success. What I wanted to go through was kind of my process of how I got ready for things. So this private pilot oral exam guide, it's by ASA. I read this probably 3 times and then had little earmarks for each of the subjects that I wanted to go back to and revisit. This was a really awesome book. Again, I'm not affiliated by any way, shape, or means. I just wanted to share my experience and how I studied. Get this book, I think it's $15, and it helped tremendously. One of the other things I had was the PHAC. I didn't reference this as much just because there is so much out there on YouTube and on ground school. So I went through Pilot Institute for my ground school, and I was able to go through and reference those videos over and over again. And that really helped me really go through lessons and get someone explaining them to me rather than trying to read them. I referenced a couple things in here for airspace classifications and minimums and all that stuff, but this is another really good book to have. I, of course, had the Private Pilot Airplane Airman Certification Standard. This is what you get tested on. So it's an open test. They'll tell you exactly what you need to know in order to pass your check ride. So I read this probably 3 or 4 times. When I would go up and practice my flight training, I would actually pull out sections from this book and see if I could do them to the standard. This really helped. It tells you exactly what your DPE is going to be testing you on. So get a copy of this and just understand what you need to be able to do to pass your check ride. I, of course, had the FAR-AIM. So this is from 2023. I had my check ride in the first day of February, so I didn't go buy a new 24 FAR-AIM for it. But you can also see I went through and I tabbed every single section in here. I didn't reference every single section, but it was really helpful putting the tabs in because it allowed you and helped you understand where different things were in the FAR-AIM and helped you break it down of like 91203, what does that mean? What's that? How's that compare to section 61? And so that was really helpful going through and tabbing the book. It took a little bit of time, but was really helpful when I was studying. So to go to my check ride, I actually had my check ride canceled twice. The first time was because I didn't have proper documentation for the plane. The day before, the person before me cleaned out the plane and actually threw away our airworthiness certificate. So the morning of my check ride, I went to the plane, started getting everything together, and couldn't find the airworthiness certificate. So I had to cancel. The second time, I had to wait actually 60 days before my DPE had another appointment available for me. So I scheduled it. Of course, the day of, it was raining, gross, and had to postpone it. I actually had to wait another 60 days, he told me, before I could get in for another appointment. But my endorsement for taking the check ride was expiring. And so I called him every single day asking if he had a cancellation. And lo and behold, 3 days after my canceled check ride, he had one. So I jumped in the plane, ran over there, and got my check ride done. Very fortunate. I think I had 3 days left on my endorsement before I was able, before it was canceled or no longer valid, and I'd have to go through another 3 hours of training with my flight instructor. So very fortunate that I got it done, and so I wanted to actually go through exactly how that started. So for the first piece, of course, everyone knows we start with our oral exam. We started with the IACRA application, and he validated all my info. What we really went through there was my logbook. And one of the things he really looked at was making sure I had each and every required piece needed. So I had my long cross country, I had my instrument ratings, or my instrument time. He went really through all of that to make sure that it was actually on there and signed. So one of the things that really helped with that was my instructor gave me a piece of paper that basically had each of the requirements on it. So it says 1 night cross country, 10 night takeoff and landings, 3 hours of prep training within 60 days, or 10 solo hours of flight. I actually went through my logbook, pulled out the dates that I did each of those, and they were all referenceable on this one sheet. And so when he said, show me where your solo cross country was. So I knew I did 150 nautical miles to N71 to 58 Mike to Kilo Whiskey Whiskey Delta back to November 71. And I did that on 10/24. Went to the logbook, he went and right to the date, saw my instructor's signature, and we moved on to the next thing. So pulling out all of your relevant flight training that is required really sped things up. I think it still took about a half hour to get through IACRA, but this really sped it up. So make sure your logbook is done completely. Make sure you know exactly where every single one of those dates are that you did one of the flights, and make sure that you have your instructor's signature on it. It's really important because you spend a ton of time going through that before the check ride even starts. So make sure your logbook is in good order. We then went through all of my endorsements. I actually had my logbook printed out because halfway through training, I used ForeFlight, but my instructor wasn't getting my signature requests. So what I had was half in digital, half in written. So I just printed the whole thing out, and I had him sign my lessons as we went through. So I did have a paper copy. Electronic is perfectly fine. He didn't ask any questions about that whatsoever. But just make sure that all your endorsements and your logbook is complete. I then gave him my license, my student pilot certificate, and my medical. So he checked all of that, and then we started the IACRA form. Make sure you bring a computer or an iPad or something that has internet access, because you will actually have to sign into IACRA. Once the DPE signs off that you are in IACRA and the check ride has started, you have to go in and sign yourself. So make sure you have access to the internet. He would have allowed me to use his, but with all the sign-ins and passwords and all that stuff, just bring your own. Make sure you can get into your IACRA account. So when we were going through my logbook, he asked me to show him my instrument time and my solo cross countries. So again, having those all pulled out, knowing exactly when I did them, helped tremendously. And then we went through our VFR flight plan. So he had me leave from the Harrisburg airport that we were at, and we were flying to Pittsburgh for a football game. So he had me break that down and how we went through that. So I did use ForeFlight for my flight planning. I was able to go in and just put in my points in ForeFlight, and then I went through and marked them in the flight log of saying, hey, we're crossing over a big industrial building here. Hey, we're crossing over a river. Hey, we're crossing over this major road. And I had that all listed with the times on it using ForeFlight, and was really simple to go through. One of the things that he really did like was that I printed out the maps of every single one of them and the chart supplement for each airport, as well as 3 alternates, just in case that something was going on. I had every piece of paper right at hand for me for the alternates, and he really liked how prepared I was with those alternate airports if something should go wrong. I actually did call 1-800-WX-BRIEF before in the morning of my check ride and got a briefing from a weather briefer and was able to give him the weather and everything that he told me. So that was really helpful as well and showed that I actually did it. He told me that we were not going to fly there. We flew to my first checkpoint, and that was it. So you don't need to prepare in your mind that you're actually flying to your destination in your cross country, but you do need to show that you were prepared to actually do it. So again, pulling out all the chart supplements, all of the maps for your airport that you're leaving, that you're coming to, and making sure that you have all of that information at hand really shows that you are prepared and a safe pilot. So one of the big things that we really talked through in my flight plan was he asked about airspace on the route. He asked me which airspaces we were going through. We didn't play the rocket ship game to go through all of the airspaces, but he did have me go through what airspace I was going through. He had me going to Pittsburgh, but I told him that we were going to a satellite airport, and he asked me why. I said there was no need to go into the Bravo airspace. There's plenty of airports around that we didn't need to go into the Bravo, and he said, okay, that's fine. Then we talked about the weather along our route. Fortunately, I had called 1-800-WX-BRIEF before and had a very nice synopsis of that brief, as well as the for-flight briefing. So there was 2 different weather sources that I had showed him. Also going on to 1-800-WeatherBrief.com and showing him that and talking through each of those things that I actually look for when I am getting ready to take a flight. He then went through, he pulled up a weather chart and he asked me about each of the fronts, what they looked like. So a warm front with the bubbles on it that were red, and an occluded front, a stationary front. He wanted me to make sure I understood each of those pieces, and that's what he really was showing through the weather. He then also took a big picture of the United States map from a weather map, and he said, okay, show me where the windiest part of the country is right now. And he was really looking at those isobars, trying to see if I could tell where windiest was and where the calmest was. Fortunately, it was very calm over our area, so it was nice and easy to say, yeah, here is the calmest because the isobars are so far apart. And then he went through and asked me, what's the difference between a TAF and a METAR, and some of the explanations on those, what those differences are, as well as how often they were valid for and how often they were issued. He then asked, okay, if there's a thunderstorm, how far away do we have to be from that thunderstorm when we're flying? What's a comfortable distance for you? What's the difference between airmets and sigmets? And then he asked me what an airmet tango was and what that signified. So understanding the differences between each of those airmets, sigmets, and knowing the weather was really important in that cross-country planning and making sure that you knew what you were looking for when you were planning your cross-country. One of the things he did stump me on was he said, okay, we're looking at a thunderstorm and there's wind shear risks. What kind of wind shear are we worried about? I stumbled through that for probably 5 minutes trying to think of it, what kind of wind shear, and later on it was a microburst. So again, I didn't have that off the top of my head. I didn't know what it was. I know what a microburst is, but I couldn't think of it at the time, and I couldn't get that's what he was referencing. So I didn't get that right, but he understood that I knew that there was a significant weather phenomena that I had to be worried about when I am looking at thunderstorms. He asked, how do I get weather in the plane en route? I told him that we could ask flight service and what frequency that would be on. But then I also said, we do have ADS-B in this plane, so I could use my iPad and get weather from the iPad, and he was totally fine with that. He then asked what our atmosphere was made of. So I told him nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and a lot of other gases. And then he said to me, is there less oxygen the higher up in elevation we go? And basically what I said is no, there isn't less oxygen. It's just that the air molecules are less dense the higher we go. And so the concentration of oxygen per breath is less. And he was actually really impressed with that. He said that's one of the questions that 95% of his candidates gets wrong. And so he was impressed with that I knew that. Then he asked about my medical cert, and he asked how long mine was good for. I told him since I had a class 3, I was 39, it's good for 60 calendar months. And then he said, okay, you absolutely hated going through the medical process. When yours expires and you don't want to do it again, is there a way that you don't have to do it and you can still fly? I could not, for the life of me, remember what he was talking about. I knew that you could. I knew that you could go to your own physician and get a self-assessment done and go to them and do that, and you didn't have to go to an AME. But I completely blanked on what he was trying to go after, and the word he was looking for was basic med. So that completely escaped me, but I explained exactly what it was. I just could not remember the term basic med. So after I explained on how you did basic med and the limitations of it, he said, yeah, you're referencing basic med. And so we moved on. So knowing your medical certificates, knowing which one you have, I did not explain to him what the difference between class 1, class 2 was, class 3. I said, I have a class 3 medical, it's good for 60 months. And that's all I said. We then went into aeromedical factors, and he asked about if your passengers are getting a headache and their fingers are turning blue, what could be the culprit? I said hypoxia, and then he asked, what would you do about that? How could you fix that? And then he gave me another scenario of that we're at 3,000 feet and it's cold outside and your passengers are getting a headache and becoming delirious. What could this be? And I told him that sounds more like CO2 poisoning because we are outside and it's cold. We probably have the heater on. So I told him we'd turn the heater off, we'd descend and find an alternate airport right away and land. And he said that was a perfect answer. So understanding the difference between hypoxia and CO2 poisoning was really big for him, and knowing what you do in each of those scenarios. And then he gave me a scenario of, okay, we're flying at night and we're in my office. It's really light out. What are some things that we have to be concerned about? And I told him since that we're coming from the light environment going into a dark environment, we need to make sure that we have enough time for our eyes to adjust back to that dark and being able to get our night vision back. So that's what he was looking for. And then we moved on to the airplane. He asked me, how do we know that we are legal to fly in this airplane? And I told him that we have to ensure that it meets its type certificate and that it is airworthy through a pre-flight inspection. And he said, okay, how do you know that it confirms to your type certificate? I was actually fortunate enough, this is a club airplane, so there's only 10 of us, and I actually brought the whole logbook series with me. So I had the propeller, I had the power plant, I had the empennage, I had everything with me. And what I did several weeks before was I went through every single certification. I went through the annual, I went through the ELT inspections, I went through everything that needed to be done on an annual basis or semi-annual basis or recurring for all the ADs. And I actually put Post-it notes on them on each of the logs from when the last annual was done, when the last inspection was done, and then I put on when the next one was due. So we went through the entire logbooks really quickly and really easily, show him that the plane was legal to fly. He said, okay, we're pre-flighting for a trip at noon, and you notice that the right nav light is out. Can we still fly? And I said, according to 91205, this is not a required piece of equipment for day VFR, and that we are legal. So he didn't ask me what a tomato flames was or anything like that. He gave it very scenario-based of, you're about to fly and this is wrong. Can you fly? And that's where it just, understanding the FAR-AIM 91205, what that meant, referencing it, showed him that I was able to think through everything, that I didn't just have it memorized. I knew where to go to look to see if we were legal. Because his next thing is, he said, okay, you took a trip to a neighboring airport and during your pre-flight to come back, you notice that the fuel gauge isn't working. Can you fly? And I said, no, per 91205, that is a required instrument that we do need to fly. And he said, okay, well, how can you get the plane back? And I told him what we could do is get a ferry permit. We'd have to call the FSDO and get that ferry permit, and then we could fly it to an airport that had a mechanic on the field. So again, understanding what 91205 is, when you legally can and cannot fly per equipment on the plane was really helpful. Then we went into the documents that the plane needs. So he didn't he didn't ask me any specific thing. He just said, okay, what documents did the plane need? And that's where we went through the airworthiness certificate, registration, all of the aero type documents. He asked if we did need a radio license. I said, no, we're not going international, so we don't need a radio license. He then asked what kind of engine the plane has, what fuel does it use, what color is that fuel, and then he asked if I had ever had a contaminated fuel sample, and I haven't. But he said, okay, if you do ever get water in your fuel, where is it going to be? How are you going to see that? And I said it would be at the bottom of the sample, and the fuel would be sitting on top, so we'd see that lineation between the water and the blue fuel. He then asked about the electrical system. I told him that our instruments have battery backups. The only thing that would be impacted with this plane would be our flaps because they are electrical, as well as our radios and our lights, of course. He asked if the plane had any hydraulics on it, and I told him the brakes were hydraulic. We talked about wingtip vortices and wake turbulence, and then he gave me several scenarios of what you would do if you would take off and land before or after a big plane and wake turbulence was an issue. And then he tried to stump me, and he said, okay, none of those things are actually going to work, and you're not comfortable flying behind a big airplane taking off. What can you do? And I said, well, we can tell the tower that we're going to wait our 2 to 3 minutes, depending on the plane, and we'll just wait our turn for that wake turbulence to subside. So he was happy with that answer. We then went into hazardous attitudes. So he had me name all 5 of them, and then he actually asked me what was my favorite one. And then asked me what would I do to compensate that and overcome that hazardous attitude. Then we went through the I'm safe, which we also included safety briefings for passengers. So I gave them my spiel about the exits and not talking during critical phases of flight, what to do if there was a fire, how to use the seat belts, all that kind of stuff. So went through all of that, and I was happy with that. We then talked about VORs briefly and how do we validate that we're on the correct frequency. So I told him that's where we're listening for the Morse code. And then he asked me about the magnetic compass and if I could name any errors within that within the compass. So the oral piece of the Checkride took about 2 hours. Half hour of that was going through the IACRA and validating the logbook and my logbook. And so it took a long time. I only got 2 questions wrong and had everything really prepared. So that really sped things up for us because I've heard of 3 to 4 hour oral check rides. And if you don't have all of your stuff together, that definitely could be the thing. So one of the things that really helped me in my check ride in speeding that oral piece up was I had everything in a folder, and then I had everything Post-it noted. So I had my medical test, I had my solo test that I did. I had a piece on cost sharing. He did talk about cost sharing and whether or not I could have people pay for it. I had a copy of the registration for the plane. I had my logbook. I had my IACRA application printed out. And everything was right here, nice and easy and very referenceable. And so that saved a ton of time and just kind of showed that I knew what I was getting into and prepared for the check ride. So everything you can do to prepare for that check ride, making sure all your documentation is in place and that you can find it easily, will really speed up that check ride. So after 2 hours, he said, okay, let's go to the plane. So we then went to the airplane. We did a pre-flight briefing in his office. And he told me what we were going to be doing. He said we were going to head to my first checkpoint on my route, but we would stay within the practice area. They had a defined practice area right outside of the airport. And so my first checkpoint was actually within the practice area, which was really, really great. And so that worked out perfectly. My timing was going to be off, though, as I had planned to climb to 8,500 feet because of mountain clearances. But the ceilings that day were 3,000. So we just decided that we were going to climb to 2,500 and keep us legal. And then we went to the plane. I did my pre-flight inspection in front of him, and he asked me to show him where the static ports were. And then he asked me to show where the VOR antennas were. So know where your antennas are on your plane and know what everything is, because everything's fair game. He can ask you exactly any questions that he wants about what's on the plane, where things are. So know your plane. I then gave him instructions on how to get in the plane. We do fly a Grumman Tiger, which is very different than a Cessna or a Piper. And so helping him get into the plane, showing him the exit, and did a real true pre-flight briefing with him because he'd only been in one of these planes once 10 years ago, he said. So it was helpful to show him and be a real true passenger in this plane. The airport that we did my check ride at was a Class Delta, and the DPE told me that to tell the controllers that we were headed to the practice area, they would know where that is. This airport is also in a TURSA, so we would pick up a squawk code and have flight following the entire time. So I got the ATIS and then contacted ground and told them that we were ready to taxi. He said, let's start with a soft field takeoff. So that's what we did. We taxied to the runway that was told to us by the controllers, and we did our soft field takeoff. And then we started to my first checkpoint on my cross country. However, my first checkpoint was on a heading of 260 off of the airport, which we were departing runway 26, which was perfect. However, the airport was really busy that day, and so the controllers had us turn to a heading of 290 right away and flew for 10 minutes in the wrong direction. So that kind of busted my plan right away. But as soon as we got the clearance from the controller of resuming our own navigation, we were about 10 minutes out, which put us virtually parallel to my first checkpoint. So I just turned 90 degrees and started heading to my checkpoint. And then very quickly he said, okay, there's a bad storm ahead of us and we need to divert to the nearest airport. He said, what airport are you looking for and how far is it and how much gas is it going to take? So I pulled up my iPad, clicked on the nearest airport, found the airport, turned to that heading, clicked on the autopilot. We have a blue button in there that's for straight and level flight. So clicked that as I did my calculations. So I told him how long it was going to take. I told him about how much fuel it was going to take, and he said, okay, great. I was able to use my iPad. I used my phone with it that had a digital E6B on it to use all my calculations, and he didn't say a thing about it, so he was totally fine with that. And then when I gave him my answers, he said, yeah, that sounds about right, and said, okay, let's do steep turns. So we climbed up to 2,500 feet and started doing steep turns. My steep turn to the right wasn't great. And so he said, I think I was holding about 40 degrees in and out, and it wasn't great. So he said, okay, let's try this again. The first time I did it to the left and it was perfect. Did it to the right, wasn't so good. So I was able to continue going all the way through. And because I did about 90 degrees of the turn at about 40 degrees, and he said, how steep do we have to be again? So did it to 45, and that's when I started my complete 360 circle. So I recentered my heading bug and did 360 at 45 degrees to the point that I started at 45 degrees. So again, it's not that you're executing things perfectly right away. It's that you're able to correct them and notice when things aren't going right. And again, that's where it's helpful to have the Airman Certification Standards to know what your standards are. You need to practice the standards. So after the steep turns, he said, okay, let's do a slow flight. So disconnected the autopilot because our autopilot doesn't like slow flight really. So turned it off. We did a couple of shallow turns and then did some climbs. And he's really looking for coordinated flight there. So really make sure you're on your rudder and making sure that you stay coordinated in your turns and the slow flight. That's what he was really looking for there. After we did that for about 5 minutes, he said, okay, since we're in a slow flight, let's do power off stalls. So we did 2 stalls. And then he said, okay, let's clean it up and do a power on stall. I told him that we were only going to go up to 65% power because this plane really doesn't like to stall and we'd have to have a really steep attitude for it. And he said, that's fine. Again, knowing your standards, that's what the standard is. You have to have 65% power or more going into your power on stall. And so if you're not comfortable going full power and having that nose pitched all the way up, go to 65. That's what the standard is. And he said that was totally fine. So we did the stall, and then he said, let's do some hood work. So I put my foggles on, and actually as we were going through, about 2 minutes in, we got a traffic alert from flight following that there was traffic in the area. So he took the controls. We climbed up a little bit higher and got out of the way. So again, very important having a safety pilot with you. Got us out of the danger, out of the traffic, and then we kept on going with the hood work. We did about 15 minutes of hood work, and then he said, okay, take the foggles off, and he said, there's a simulated engine fire. What are you doing? So I told him we were turning off the gas, pulling the mixture, turning off the master, and then did an emergency descent. We got down to about 2,000 feet, had me recover, and then he said, okay, you had an engine failure. What are you doing? This is where one of my screw-ups came in. I told him that we were turning on the fuel pump, switching gas tanks, pulling carb heat, would cycle the magnetos and try to restart. And then he kind of looked at me like, you're missing something here. I was cruising at 85 knots, not the 72, which is my best glide speed. And so once I realized that, I pulled it back, got my speed down to 72, and then started looking for a field to land in. Fortunately, we were on a left base for a perfect field landing that I had picked out for him. And I think we got down to about 1,500 feet, and he said, okay, good, recover. So again, not having everything perfectly in place is okay. It's realizing when you are making a mistake or not holding things to standard and that you're fixing them. That's the biggest thing. That's what they're really looking for. So we recovered, and he said, okay, let's go do ground reference maneuvers. And he said, which maneuver do you want to do? I chose to do S-turns over a road. So we headed over to a road that he knew that he had used for S-turns. And he said, which direction are we starting? There was a bunch of buildings off to the left-hand side. So I said, let's go to the right just in case we have an engine failure or whatever. We're not over a bunch of buildings. And he said, yeah, good choice. So I did one turn each direction over the road, and then he said, okay, let's head back to the airport and work on our landings. So I headed back to the airport. I made my radio call because we were still in we're coming back to the Class Delta airspace. Told them that we were coming inbound for pattern work. We were told to set up for a left downwind and then quickly got vectored around. There was a medevac chopper coming in, and so we got vectored way off course. We were basically over the landing strip when we were told that we could resume navigation again. And so I had to do a really weird turn to get back to the pattern. But he said this was perfect practice. This is exactly how the real world works. And he was actually really pleased that the controller was giving us something unusual to work with. So our first landing was a soft field landing. And he said, when I did my landing, he said, yeah, I had a really nice view of the center line because I was way far off on the center line. And so he was kind of poking me on that to make sure that I was more to the center line on my next landing. When we came in, we weren't cleared for the option. So when we landed, Tower told us to taxi back to the FBO. And he got on the radio and said, we're actually still working on pattern work. So they had us taxi back. We had to wait about 10 minutes for other landing traffic. And so we had to sit there. When we were cleared to take off, he said, okay, let's do our short field takeoff and our short field landing. So the short field landing was the one I was kind of the most nervous about just because, you have to land and touch down within 200 feet. Fortunately, that went okay. Both the takeoff and the landing were fine. Then we did have the option for that one, so we went around, and he wanted to do an aborted landing. So we got down to about 500 feet, and I called Tower, I said, I'm going around, pushed full power, started getting positive rate of climb, clicked in one notch of flaps, kept climbing, and then cleaned up all the way and took all of the flaps out. So he was happy with that. The next time around, we did slip to a point for a landing. And one of the things that I screwed up on, we came in around, I was coming a little fast. And so I knew I wasn't going to make the point, and I went around. I had in my head from the short field landing that the slip to landing was a 200-foot margin like the short field, when in actuality it's 400 feet. So that was something I just completely forgot about and didn't realize or didn't remember what my margin of error was for slips to a point. So I went around and then told him I was going to do it again. And when I came again, I was still fast. And I told him I was going to go around, and he said, no, you have 400 feet, which I was well within the margin of. And so we just landed. And fortunately, he told me that standard of 400 feet, which really helped. And then we landed, and he said, okay, let's go back to the FBO. And so I made my radio call, told him that it was going to be a full stop when we landed, and we headed back to the airport. He then said, okay, hey, I'm running late. I need to get out and go to a football game. And as soon as we park, can I jump out of the plane? And I said, well, no, you have to wait till I get the plane shut down and the propeller stops spinning. And he said, okay, good. So that was his last little test question for me. That it did not sound like a test. It sounded like he was legitimately late for a football game and wanted to get out. So I did pass that last question of his. We pulled into the FBO and shut the plane down, and he looked at me and said, okay, well, that's a pass. Had a bunch of relief there. We went to the FBO, went back to his office and did a complete debrief. and went through the oral exam, went through the flight exam, and just kind of recapped the entire flight. So if you have any questions, if you're getting ready for your check ride and you have any thoughts or questions or comments or whatever, just drop a message below. I'd love to help. I'd love to give you my insight of what my check ride was like. Just let me know. I'll try to answer them, and good luck.